All right, Facebook. Mike Davis is back here live from the Oasis, part two. Much quicker than I thought we were going to be. So we didn't have as many questions this time. So we're going to jump right into the study. Let's pray and we'll jump right into the study. Lord, we thank you so much for this study. We thank you that we're able to look into your word and your spirit leads and guides us. We thank you, Lord, for the wisdom that you impart to us by your word and by your spirit as we learn how to live according to your will, walking worthy of you into all pleasing. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay, so hopefully this is seem like I'm a little bit centered here. Okay, hopefully this is the last message on not who's the boss. We're on message 93. Can you believe that? But this is, I believe, the last message where I'm talking about what Mike Winger gets wrong about Kephale. And I think I'm finally saying that word right now. We that kind of is morphed over into talking about what he was getting wrong about different scholars. So what I've been covering for the past few weeks is what he got wrong about Dr. Lynn Cohick, and then the last couple of messages, what he was getting wrong about Dr. Richard Cervin. Now, reason we're doing this is because of what Mike says about these scholars, and we're going to hear him say it again towards the end of today's message, where he accuses them of distorting the scriptures, distorting. He accuses egalitarians of just distorting scriptures and distorting understanding, and then that distortion comes to people so that they don't understand what's going on. And my view, as we go through this, is we're going to see the problem is not that egalitarian scholars, the scholars that Mike is quoting, that they are distorting things. It's Mike's understanding. His understanding is distorted. And what I mean by distorted, he misunderstands. And by misunderstanding, he misinterprets and he mischaracterizes what the scholars are saying. We're going to see that again this morning. We've been seeing it over the past few weeks. It takes a little bit to get through all of this because I want to make sure that I am quoting him correctly. I want to make sure that I'm understanding his point. So I'm taking a little bit at a time to make sure that we are really understanding where he is coming from. Okay. Again, Proverbs 18:17 tells us that, well, let me go back there and read it for you here. Proverbs chapter 18 and verse 17. I've told the people of our fellowship to pray for me, and I ask you all to pray for me. I was up late. I only got a few hours of sleep, so I'm sticking close to my notes today and trying not to ad lib. Okay. Proverbs chapter 18 and verse 17 says, the first one to plead his cause seems right until his neighbor comes and examines him. All right. So this is what we're doing. We're acting as Mike's neighbor, and we are cross-examining what he has said. And what we're seeing is that he is not right. And again, the reason I'm doing this is because people listen to Mike Winger. He has a large following. They really feel like, hey, he has sealed the deal. I was just listening to someone this week who was again saying, Mike convinced me to stop being egalitarian and to become complementarian, at least soft complementarian. And my difficulty is that Mike gets a lot of things wrong that he is not. And I hate this to have to say this is the nicest way I know to say it. He's not a reliable guide when it comes to this topic. Okay, so let's finish up our topic here, and we're going to look at a video video number one, where Mike Winger is talking about uh, male headship. And let's see, what do I say? He's going to criticize Dr. Cervin's use of, or his non use of New Testament lexicons. And he's going to accuse Dr. Cervin of throwing them all out. Now, we kind of covered this a little bit last week. I want to cover this portion here. Let me make sure that this is set up properly so you can hear it. Yep, we're all set up. There we go. Okay, so this is yep, clip number one. So let's listen to this for a second. And we're going to look at what he gets wrong about Dr. Cervin's reasons. Here we go.
But he refuses to use any of them, and he gives you reasons in his paper why. Let me summarize them. Maybe they're influenced by a patriarchal culture. Maybe they can't tell what Greek means here, because he supposes they're just bad at their job. He accuses them of not reading extra biblical sources like Plato, Herodotus, or Plutarch. But they do. Like BDAG, gold standard, BDAG quotes Plato, Herodotus, Plutarch all the time. So this is weird. What he's done is he's taken all of the most relevant lexicons and he's thrown them out and says none of them apply. So that when someone says to me,
okay, so what he says here is that, and we played a little bit of this last week, kind of covered it in detail. Let me stop sharing here. Covered it in detail in terms of why Dr. Cervin is utilizing non-New Testament lexicons or general Greek lexicon rather than utilizing um, uh, New Testament Greek lexicons and trying to understand the meaning of Kephale. Okay. So he criticizes him and he criticizes his non-use of New Testament lexicons. He accuses him, as you see at the very end, of throwing out all of the relevant lexicons, the Greek New Testament lexicons. Now, Dr. Cervin doesn't do this, and I'm going to show you this toward the end. He doesn't throw out all of the relevant New Testament lexicon. Mike misses the point of what Dr. Cervin is doing in the article. Now, again, Cervin is wanting to know, as we covered last week, why is it that all Greek New Testament lexicons, like with the exception of BDAG, last week I was saying D-bag, it's actually BDAG. This is because of the way it was written in this older article, but it's BDAG, which stands for Bauer, Danker, Arndt, and Gingrich. These were some of the compilers um, lexicon. These were the lexic lexic lex. Here we go again. Lexicographers. Got it. Lexicographers. These were the lexicographers. I promise. I practiced this all week. The lexicographers who compile what we call BDAC. Okay, it just uses their last names. So, Server wanted to know why is it that most of all of these different lexicons, why do they have leader as one of the meanings of kephale when I look at older non-Greek New Testament lexicons, they don't have it. So he gives us reasons why New Testament lexicons may have leader as a gloss or a meaning. And again, we covered this last week. So you can go back to video number 92 to look at that. I want to examine a little bit further more of Cervin's possible reasons as to why the New Testament Greek lexicons has as one of the meanings of kephale leader. Okay. And this has to do with one of his reasons, which is the influence of Latin on Testament lexicons, Greek New Testament lexicons. Now, I shared a little bit on it last week, and I said I was going to come back and share a little bit more. So here I am fulfilling my promise to you. So well, first of all, let me say this. Cervin does see value. Mike said he sees no value. He throws out all the relevant lexicons like they don't have any value. That's not really what Cervin himself says about like BDOG, okay, which is one of the most respected and widely used Greek English lexicons for the New Testament. This is actually, and it's funny because Cervin states the value of BDOG in the article that Mike is referring to. This is what Cervin says on page 2. He says the value of dog, this is how he was writing it in 1999. Then later on, it becomes BDOG, which is why I kept saying BDAG last week. The value of, I'm just going to say BDOG, lies more. Now, notice he says the value of dog or BDOG lies more in their citations of literature and their bibliography rather than in the definitions per se. I do not wish to undermine the value of BDOG, but it is deficient in certain respects. If theologians only use BDOG, they automatically restrict their understanding of the Greek language, which in turn affects their exegesis. Okay, so he says BDOG does have value, but the value is not really in the definitions which they give. Now, this is Cervin's point of view. He says that the value is in the citations of Greek literature and the bibliography that they have for Greek literature. So again, Cervin does recognize, and Mike was saying, he says they don't read Herodotus, they don't read Plutarch. Yes, they do. It's in BDOT. Cervin acknowledges this. Okay, he acknowledges that. Um, and again, if you could go back to last week's video to see more of why he makes the statement that he says about um, theologians not really focusing on classical literature. Okay, we talked about it last week. Now, Cervin notes what that BDOC has value. He also notes that it has limitations, and he states that if theologians and scholars only look at and use BDOC, they limit and restrict themselves and their understanding of the Greek. That's the difficulty he has. Is listen, if you're a theologian, if you're a scholar, I would say if you're a pastor and you're utilizing BDOC, what Cervin would be saying is you are limiting your understanding of the Greek. This is why Cervin goes to Greek lexicons that are outside of the New Testament, that are what I call non-New Testament. They're not dealing with the New Testament specifically. They are outside of that because he wants to expand the semantic range, or the semantic that he wants to widen the number of meanings that you can see that the word kephale could carry. Okay, so uh, nowhere in his article does Cervin say don't use lexicons, nor does he say they are irrelevant. That's Mike's inference. That's Mike's eisegesis of what Cervin said. Cervin never calls them irrelevant. He never says don't use them. As we're going to see later, Cervin actually utilizes some lexicons. Okay. All right. So wanted to say that. Now, like I said, Mike also, he misses the point of Cervin's article. He misses the point of why Cervin wrote the article in the first place. So let's go to um, another clip that I have here. And this is clip number 2, and we're going to look at what Mike has to say about Cervin. Here we go. About Cervin and problems he has with Cervin. Oops. Here we go. Forgot to clip on it, and here we go. All right, here we go. Short clip here.
Rebuttal, and he's specifically rebutting Wayne Grudem. Interestingly, they went back and forth, but I think Grudem won. So Cervin refuses to analyze. Here's some problems with this paper. He analyzes all these ancient lexicons, but he refuses. He will not analyze any New Testament examples of kephale. So he's going to try to think. His paper's being used to weigh in on what Paul meant by kephale. He never even looks at Paul. He never reads or quotes or uses or analyzes New Testament uses. But that's the point of the paper in the end, is it's used to talk about the New Testament use.
Okay, so the problem that Mike has with this paper, Cervin's paper, I'm going to leave it up there for just a second. First is that Cervin does not analyze Paul and Paul's usages. And Mike, he goes on. He says Cervin's paper is used to show the meaning of kephale, but Cervin never analyzes New Testament usages of kephale. However, what Mike doesn't do is he really doesn't cite the reason, Cervin's reason for writing the paper. The title of the paper, you can see it here. This is why I left it up. The title of the paper is, Does Kephale Mean Source or Authority Over in Greek Literature, a Rebuttal? So what is Cervin doing here? He is he's writing a rebuttal to Dr. Wayne Grudem, to a paper that Dr. Wayne Grudem wrote. Okay. Now, Mike does state Cervin, this is a rebuttal to Wayne Grudem. However, he does not go on to cite Cervin's 3 aims in writing this paper. He acknowledges that it's a rebuttal to Wayne Grudem, but he never ever cites Paul. He doesn't analyze Paul. And that's because that wasn't his goal. So, what is his goal? Cervin cites 3 reasons in his paper, which you can go find this paper online. It's available online on page, I believe it's page 1. Page 1 or 2, he cites the reasons, 3 of them, for writing this paper. Number 1, he wants to do a summary and a critique of Grudem's assumptions and methodology. He wants to look at some things that Grudem is assuming and the methodology that he uses in arriving at his conclusions. Number 2, he looks at, and he says in the paper, he wants to examine Grudem's treatment of the argument for the meaning of source for kephale. So he wants to look at, Grudem doesn't believe it could be translated, or that kephale means source. He wants to look at that. Number 3, he wants to examine Grudem's example at length and demonstrate that most of Grudem's examples do not support Grudem's claims. So he's saying, listen, Grudem has made some claims, he's got some examples, but his examples don't support his claim. Now, when you go back and read the article, he literally says, this is why I'm writing this paper. Okay? Cervin's paper And the aim of the paper is to deal with Wayne Grudem's methodology, his claims, and his conclusions about Kephale. Now, there are people who use it to examine Paul's usage of Kephale, but that is not Dr. Cervin's stated purpose. His purpose in the paper, in the article, is not to examine the usage of Paul. His purpose is to examine Grudem's, his claims, his conclusions, his assumptions, his methodology. This is what he's doing in the paper. And he states that quite clearly and plainly in the beginning. And this is not cited by Mike. Now, the reason this is important because when he says that, well, he doesn't do any analysis of Paul. The way he positions it is that he makes it sound like Dr. Cervin is not doing research. He never covers Paul. But again, that's not his goal. His goal is not to cover Paul, is to look at how Wayne Grudem is the methods, the claims, the conclusions that he makes about Kephale. He wants to examine all of that. Now, his critique of Grudem and his conclusions, Dr. Cervin's conclusions, it does have relevance for understanding how Paul uses Kephale, which is why a lot of people, Egalitarians, will go to this paper and look at it because it does have relevance. However, that is not his stated goal. That's not the goal of Dr. Cervin. So I just want to make that clear because, again, Mike positions this, the way he frames this, and as somebody who teaches communication, framing is important. The way you frame a discussion, the way you put a meaning around it, and you say, well, this is what this is about, is going to cause you to perceive things a certain way. And he's framing this as if, hey, Cervin is not really being a good scholar here because he's not even dealing with Paul in his analysis. However, again, that's what Cervin does not say. That's his purpose. He has a purpose of rebutting Dr. Wayne Grudem. So just wanted to make that clear. Cervin states, like a good scholar, what his aims are in the paper. And this is what he does throughout the paper. So again, Mike misunderstands what Cervin's paper, what his stated goals are, and what he's doing throughout the paper. All right. Now, Cervin, I want to talk about this. Cervin talks about the influence of Latin on understanding the Greek and then understanding Kephale. He talks about that. He asked the question, and like I said before, Cervin did not reject all New Testament lexicons. He didn't do that. He posed the question: why do New Testament lexicons have leader as a meaning of Kephale when older general Greek lexicons, the ones that he was looking up, they don't have leader as a meaning of Kephale? And again, as I said last week, that's a good question. If you're looking at older lexicons that are older than some of the New Testament lexicons that we have now, and you're going, how come these older lexicons, if Kephale meant leader, if that was common in Greek? And again, Cervin never says Kephale cannot refer to a leader. He talks about the Septuagint. What he says is it's not common. And by the way, that's what most egalitarian scholars will say. It is not a common meaning of the term. In other words, if you would have utilized Kephale in the first century and talk about it as being a leader, for a lot of people, it would have kind of went over the head. It was not a normal way of talking about a leader, a person who has authority over others. There were other Greek terms that spoke more directly to that. Okay. So Cervin wanted to know if this was so common, like complementarians are saying, like Wayne Grudem is saying, how come we don't see it in some of these older lexicons? So he poses as a possibility, one of the possibilities is the influence of Latin on the understanding of the Greek term Kephale. Okay. Now, what do I mean? This is why I want to go into a little bit more detail. Latin, and Cervin writes about this in the article, was the language of scholarship from the medieval period to about the 19th century. In other words, theologians, scholars, biblical scholars, they wrote all of their works and their commentaries in Latin. When they were writing to one another, they were putting down their words and their works and their ideas in Latin. Okay. And they would use when they would do their translations, they would use what is known as a Greek Latin lexicon. Okay, a Greek Latin lexicons. These were lexicons that had Greek words, and then you would have the Latin equivalent of the Greek word. Like today, we have Greek English lexicon. Like I have up on my shelf a Thayer's Greek English lexicon. And what you have is there you have the Greek terms, and then you have the equivalent English terms that can give you some idea as to how you to understand the word in Greek. Well, back then they were using Greek Latin dictionaries because again, Latin was the lingua franca. Latin was the language of scholarship. It was the language that they used to write to do their commentaries. So when they did translation work, they would translate a word from the original Greek into Latin. All right. That meant that they had to go and find a Latin equivalent for a Greek word. So if they're writing about Kephale, let's say someone is doing a translation or doing a commentary on the book of Ephesians, chapter 5, when it says the husband is the husband's it says to the wife that the husband is the head of the wife. Well, they have to look at that word. Okay, in Greek, it's kephale. What's the Latin equivalent? And the word that they would choose as the Latin equivalent to kephale was the the Latin term caput, C-A-P-U-T, caput. All right. Now, this was the Latin term. So, kephale means head. What is head in Greek? Caput, right? That's the Latin term. So they would write down, okay, we're translating this. You write down that the speaking to the wife, the husband is the caput of the wife. Okay. Even as Christ is the caput of the body, right? Head. Here's the problem. In Latin, caput can mean, metaphorically, it can mean leader or the one who's in charge or the one who has authority. It can mean that. It was a common meaning in Latin. Now, keep in mind, what we're saying is this was not a common meaning in Greek, but it was a common meaning in Latin. So, unlike kephale, uh, leader, one of authority, this was a common meaning for caput. All right. So it was a common practice for the times for now, again, it was a common practice for scholars to translate Greek words into Latin. They would do this. But here's where the difficulty would be. It could lead to a problem. And the problem it can lead to, I read an article, and if I had more time, I would have created a PowerPoint to show it to you. But I posted this on my website. So if you, I mean, not my website, on my Facebook page. I posted it last night. An article by Dr. Hans Forster. It's called Translating from Greek as a Source Language, the Lasting Influence of Latin on New Testament Translation. Translating from Greek as a source language, the lasting influence of Latin on New Testament translation by Dr. Hans Forster. Now, the reason I found this article because when I saw that Dr. Richard Cervin was saying that Latin can be a reason why kephale is being seen or understood in Greek New Testaments as meaning leader, Latin could be the reason for this because in the early days, the medieval period to the 19th century, scholars were normally utilizing Latin. And so when they would write kephale into Latin, they would use the Latin term caput. Caput in Latin can have and does have as a metaphorical meaning, and it was common that it could mean a leader or one who's in charge. So when I read that, I went, has anybody else written about this? So I started doing research. I went online, started doing research, tapped it in, used AI, tapped it in, and it brought me to this article by Dr. Hans Forster, which is again translating from Greek as a source language, the lasting influence of Latin or New Testament translation. I think I've read the article now 4 or 5 times. It's a fascinating article. And you can download it for free. It's on the web, internet. I would highly recommend it. Let me read you what Dr. Forster said. I was going to read just a little bit. I'm going to read a little bit more. This is on page 87 of the article. He says, quote, lexical equivalence in one of the most important tools of New Testament philology, the famous Bauer Elan and its English translation, BDAG, are deeply rooted either in Latin semantics or in Martin Luther's translational choice. So what he's saying is that some of the lexical equivalents and some of the tools of philology that they use, the tools that study of words, the famous Bauer Elan and its English translation, BDOC, which is what Mike Winger was talking about. He's saying these works, even though they're Greek, they are deeply rooted in either Latin semantics, or in Martin Luther's translational choices. Now, where they're talking about Martin Luther would translate from the Greek into German. And Martin Luther would utilize a Latin dictionary because he was utilizing, I believe it was the Greek translation of Aramis, who was an early scholar. And so he would utilize not only a Greek dictionary, but a Latin dictionary to translate into German. Okay. He goes on to say, at the same time, Luther, and by the way, so what other people would do later on, they would utilize Luther's work, they would utilize Aramaeus works, they would utilize Latin. So this is why he says it's deeply rooted in Latin. Even B dot, deeply rooted in Latin. He says, quote, at the same time, Luther and other groundbreaking and authoritative translations like the King James Version or Tyndale translations were inevitably deeply influenced by Latin as the then prevalent language of academic discourse. Again, saying the same thing that Cervin said. This was the lingua franca of the day. And so he says, even our King James and the Tyndale translation were deeply influenced by Latin because Latin was the language that was being used by scholars. It was the academic language. He goes on to say, and this is the point I really want to go to, quote, the dictionaries available at the time were Greek Latin dictionaries, which drew heavily on the translational equivalents of the Vulgate. The Vulgate was a Latin translation of the Bible. Thus, semantics of Latin equivalents would and could not be understood as differing from Greek semantics. Now, to know it's a lot. You're dealing with a linguist here, Dr. Hans Forster. He says the semantics of Latin equivalents would and could not be understood as differing from Greek semantics. This is on page 87, paragraph 2. So, what is he saying? He says that when the people were translating from Greek into Latin, the Latin meaning of words, they understood the Latin meaning of words as being the meaning of the Greek words. They're translating from Greek to Latin, but they're looking at the Greek through Latin meanings. And so they see the Greek as having the same meaning as the Latin. So if they're translating Kephale from Greek into Latin, it could be understood and probably was understood as having the meaning of kaput. What's the meaning of kaput? Kaput means head, but kaput also carries the metaphorical meaning of leader, of one who's in charge. And so they would look at carefully the Greek term that did not have it as a normal meaning. They would look at it through the lens of the Latin term caput, and they would see Kephale as having the same Latin meaning as caput. Is that clear? Okay, so the Latin is now kind of reaching back and influencing how they are understanding the Greek. They're understanding the Greek through the Latin. It's not that they have the same meaning, is that that is how some scholars were beginning to look upon the Greek. Okay. So this is what Dr. Hans Forster talks about in his article. Now, in the article, let me be clear, he is not talking about Kephale. He's talking about the influence, though, of Latin on the on translations of the Greek New Testament and how Latin influenced the meaning and the understanding of scholars where the Greek was concerned. That they had a they had a Latin understanding of the Greek terms. All right. So uh, to go on from there, this is the problem that it could lead to. The problem was that now we don't differentiate the terms, well, the meanings. We now see that the meaning of kaput is the meaning of Kephale. So according to Dr. Forster, theologians and translator understood Greek terms in light of Latin meanings. This is what Cervin is arguing in his article. Now, to make sure I was understanding Dr. Forster and Dr. Cervin correctly, I wrote to Dr. Forster. I wrote to Dr. Hans Forster. I explained to him what I was doing. He asked me for a little bit of information about what Cervin was talking about. I sent him the article by Cervin. I sent him the quotes by Lynn Cohick. He was kind enough to write me back. And basically he said, yeah, there is validity to what he is saying. And then he said, maybe we should write it like this, or maybe you should write it or present it like this. And so he helped me to craft a statement that dealt with Cervin's argument that Latin was influencing the Greek. And this is the quote. He says, quote, here is why Cervin believes New Testament lexicons provide authority over or leader as definitions for Kephale, all the things I just said. And here is an article by Dr. Forster that gives some credence to his, Cervin's, thought that Latin and medieval interpretation may have influenced the New Testament lexicons. And that's from a personal email that I have from Dr. Forster. Okay. So he does say there is some credence, and Dr. Forster's uh, article lends credence to the idea that Dr. Cervin has that Kephale, keep in mind, what's the original question? Why is it that New Testament lexicons are translating Kephale as meaning leader, one in authority, when non New Testament lexicons don't carry that as a meaning? And it is because, according to Dr. Cervin's argument, Greek Greek English lexicons that we have now, like BDAG, are deeply rooted in Latin. They're deep. Or let me go back to what he said before. He says that lexical equivalents, the most famous, and it's English. Well, one of the most famous being BDAG. They are deeply rooted either in Latin semantics. They're deeply rooted in Latin semantics or in Martin Luther's translational choices. Okay, or choice. So, and he says the dictionary available at the time were Greek Latin dictionaries, which drew heavily on the translational equivalents of the Vulgate. The semantics of Latin equivalents would and could not be understood as differing from Greek semantics. So even BDAG, and in the article, he traces the history of BDAG, and he shows how BDAG is based upon earlier lexicons, which are based upon earlier lexicons, which are rooted in Latin semantics. And so the influence carries all the way through. Now, he's not saying that every single word in BDOG has a Latin influence, but what he says is, listen, it has its root in Latin semantics. And so we need to take that into account when we're looking at what do these words mean. And again, he's not covering Kephale, but he's talking about in general, this is what we see. And when you read it, I was fascinated. I've read it like 4 or 5 times now, and I was fascinated because one of the things he talks about is Martin Luther's, some of his translations could have been, well, he roots them in Latin, and it has an anti-Semitic foundation for what he was writing about the Jews. And when you start to look at the words apart from the Latin influence, and you actually get back to the Greek, free of the Latin influence, the text reads differently. It was fascinating. I was sitting here last night again reading it, going, "Wow, wow!" And Karen, my wife, goes, "What?" I said, "This is just amazing." And I explained to her when she went, "Wow." Okay, so here's the thing. Uh, uh, Dr. Servin's argument does have credence that, and I'm not saying it's 100% correct. He says it's a possibility. I think it's a very real possibility that you have to look at. That the reason Kephale is translated and understood by some as leader in the New Testament lexicons is because the New Testament lexicons, which are based upon other lexicons, which are based upon other earlier lexicons, which are rooted in Latin semantics, that the Kephale took on the Greek meaning, excuse me, took on the Latin meaning of kaput, which can mean metaphorically leader or one who is charged or one who is in charge, even though Kephale itself does not have it as a common meaning. So there is a book, which I don't have yet, but I will be getting it, called A History of New Testament uh, Lexicography. I said it right again, by Dr. John A.L. Lee. This goes into more detail. He recommends the book. I've looked up this book. There are several different websites I looked at, and they all said, this is a book you got to read. So I'm going to be getting the book as soon as I can. But he goes into the detail. He quotes Dr. Lee's book. And Dr. Lee also has the idea that, hey, look, and Dr. Lee is a linguist, and he's looking at the history of lexicons and how lexicons were influenced early on and continually by Latin semantics. Now, he doesn't say, therefore, all lexicons are bad and throw them away. He says, no, this is what we need to recognize. We need to do some reassessments. We need to kind of go through and purge some of the lexicons and reestablish what these terms mean. He doesn't say the lexicons are bad. He sees value, but what he says is, but we need to recognize that they have been influenced through through the past few hundred years by Latin semantics. And so Cervin's argument that Kephale could be influenced by Latin meaning is plausible. It is extremely plausible. Okay. So I just wanted to share that with you for all of you who's looking at it, because when I was reading, I was thinking, wow. And again, Dr. Lynn Cohick, she talks about this. Again, Martin Luther, a lot of people are using his translation. He's writing in German. Guess what? The German word is Haupt. I think it's Haupt. That word means head, but it also can mean metaphorically one who's in charge, one who's a leader. And again, they're taking Kephale and translated it into German, and now begins to take on the German meaning. So what, like Dr. John A.L. Lee was saying, Dr. Hans Forster was saying, was like, listen, we have to go back, and it's almost like you've got to clear away a lot of this, the Latin understandings and meaning, and get back to the actual Greek. This is what Cervin is endeavoring to do when he goes to non-New Testament lexicons and he's looking at earlier works to try to understand and to look at and to get a wider range of meaning. What does Kephale mean outside of New Testament lexicons, which could have been influenced by, and scholars are saying they were influenced by Latin semantics from an earlier period. Okay, so he's going outside of it. That's why he's going outside of it. And by the way, that's good methodology. That's a good way. That's what linguists do. This is how you get to a better understanding of what the words means, and then we get better lexicons. So it's necessary to do something like this. Okay, moving on here. So one of the things that Mike does is that he criticizes, which I was just talking about, he criticizes Cervin's use of early Greek words when exploring the meaning of Kephale. Let's look at that for a second. Mike, he basically criticizes and argues against it. This is clip number 3, and we're going to see what he has to say where that is concerned, and I'll comment on it. Here we go.
So here's the ones he uses. Notice the times. They're very old. They're all before.
Okay, so let me say real quick. What you see on the screen here are the works of different authors dating all the way back to the 4th century BC. These are Greek authors. These are Greek, and these authors has written certain works. Dr. Cervin went and checked their works to look at how was Kephale used in an earlier period. Now these are not lexicons. This is literature by other people. So he's looking at the literature to see how was Kephale used. Now this is what Mike is critiquing. Let me play it now again.
The closest one is Diodorus, who is like 1st century BC. Then you've got one 3rd century AD. You have nothing from the exact time of Christ. You don't have any writers who are writing during, like, say, Philo, who's actually writing around the time of Paul, around the time of Jesus. Cervin doesn't tell his readers that his lexicons are mostly from time way before the New Testament authors, or after, but not during. Now, Greek changes over time. There's ancient Greek and there's classical Greek. Koine Greek is not ancient Greek. There's connections, but they're not the same. And a lot of the guys, most of the ones on Cervin's list are writing in a different kind of Greek. And he's using them as his resource. So his whole study is like compromised in severe ways. Cervin concludes, and his show.
Okay, so let me play this one more time because I want you to hear from the beginning, because I cut in what his critique and argument is against Cervin utilizing these earlier works, looking at the usage of Kephale.
So here's the ones he uses. Notice the times. They're very old. They're all before. The closest one is Diodorus, who is like 1st century BC. Then you've got one 3rd century AD. You have nothing from the exact time of Christ. You don't have any writers who are writing during, like, say, Philo, who's actually writing around the time of Paul, around the time of Jesus. Cervin doesn't tell his readers that his lexicon.
Okay, so I'm going to stop there, and I'll come back to a moment when he talks about Cervin doesn't tell his his reader something. So here's his first part of his argument. Mike argues that Cervin is using earlier Greek works when exploring the meaning of Kephale, and he criticizes it, but he's like, he's not using anything near the time of Christ. He's using all these early works from the fourth century BC all the way down to the early first century, from the fourth century BC all the way down to the early first century. Okay, and he criticizes, and it's almost like he thinks it's kind of a gotcha for Cervin, and he says that Cervin is not doing a good job. Again, Mike doesn't get what Cervin is doing. What Dr. Cervin is doing is engaging what's known as corpus-based lexical analysis. Corpus-based lexical analysis. I know it's a mouthful. But basically what it's saying is this is where he is looking at a wide range of early Greek works, like the ones that we saw on the screen. He's examining early occurrences of Kephale in actual literary context. He's looking at things that people actually work, documents where they were utilizing this term. Like if we were to look at books today or newspapers or letters, trying to understand, and we may even go backwards to try to understand, well, how is this term actually used by people? This is what Dr. Cervin is doing, and he's doing so across different genres. He's doing so again, utilizing different time periods, because this serves the purpose of examining what meaning or meanings Kephale carries through time. It's known as a diachronic search. So he's doing a diachronic search through time. I think dia means through, and chronic mean and chronos, time. Through time, he's going all the way back. He said, well, let's look at the different meanings through time to see, has there been a shift, to see if there's been a change. Has there been a change in meaning? This is good and accepted methodology. By the way, Wayne Grudem does the same thing in his paper that Mike was referencing. And Wayne Grudem even sometimes goes beyond the first century into, I think it's like third or fourth century. He goes into later, which by the way is not good, because a later usage could not be used for Paul. You might be able to say an earlier usage might have been used by Paul, but you can't say a later usage. In other words, if the meaning of Kephale changed by the fourth century, you can't look at the fourth century. Let me put it to you like this. Let's say we look at, as Dr. Cervin did, from the fourth century, third century, second century, and we go, hey, we don't see the term leader being used as meaning, we don't see Kephale meaning leader in all of these works that we're looking at. But then we go, well, in the 5th century AD, 500 years after the time of Jesus, 500 years after the time of Paul, we do see Kephale being used as leader. That doesn't count because it's afterwards. It's afterwards. You can't read the meaning back into the term. That is being anachronistic. You can't do that. Okay. Grudem does this. He uses later works and says, well, see, it means Kephale here, but it's a later work, and you can't utilize that to say, therefore, this is how Paul used it. Just because later on somebody said it meant leader, doesn't, you can't read that later definition back into the first century of Paul. Can't do that. All right. It's not good scholarship. It's not good methodology. So, and in Cervin's article, he talks about this, and he talks about, hey, Grudem uses some later resources. Mike doesn't bring this up. Mike doesn't talk about that. But it's Grudem does look at earlier sources and then some later sources. So it's the methodology to look at earlier sources. It's not a bad thing. It's what linguists do. So what Cervin is doing is standard practice when you're trying to understand the wide range of meanings of a term. You're trying to widen the semantic range. You go and you look at what are some of the earliest uses, and let's trace it all the way down to see if there's any shifts and changes in the meaning. Mike does not appear to understand what Cervin is doing. So his criticism of Cervin in this regard is invalid. Cervin is doing what good linguists do. This is how we end up with lexicons. You look at the range of meanings of a term in order to determine what could this term possibly mean, or what did it mean through time. And then you're also looking for, as Cervin would have been doing, is there a shift in meaning as I'm looking through it? As at any time does it shift to mean leader? And he says, I'm not seeing it. It's not there. So Mike's criticism of Cervin is invalid. He's not even properly understanding what is it that Cervin is doing. Also, Mike makes the accusation that Cervin does not tell his readers about the early dates of his quotes, as if somehow Cervin is keeping something from his readers. Let's go back to that for just a moment. And that's where I stopped it. Okay. Let's see if I can. It'll play.
Are mostly from time way before the New Testament authors or after, but it probably just means something other than authority, right? He doesn't conclude it means source, but it's not really exactly meaning authority. Well, look at his conclusion though, and his conclusion supports complementarians. It's the craziest thing in the world. I feel like it's like some kind.
I moved something and it didn't do it right. So let me play it back from the beginning. Let's see. I have the numbers here.
Drama TV show. So here's the ones he uses. Notice the times. They're readers that his lexicons are the drama TV show.
Here we go.
So here's the ones he uses. Notice the times. They're very old. They're all before. The closest one is Diodorus, who is like 1st century BC. Then you've got one 3rd century AD. You have nothing from the exact time of Christ. You don't have any writers who are writing during, like, say, Philo, who's actually writing around the time of Paul, around the time of Jesus. Cervin doesn't tell his readers that his lexicons are
Sketch out a little bit.
There's
more.
Ancient drama TV show.
Play it one more time. Sorry about this.
So here's the ones he uses. Notice the times. They're very old. They're all before. The closest one is Diodorus, who is like 1st century BC. Then you've got one 3rd century AD. You have nothing from the exact time of Christ. You don't have any writers who are writing during, like, say, Philo, who's actually writing around the time of Paul, around the time of Jesus. Cervin doesn't tell his readers that his lexicons are mostly from time way before the New Testament authors or after, but not during. Now, Greek changes over time. There's ancient drama TV.
Okay, so I'll stop right there. So again, he's making the argument, hey, Cervin didn't tell his audience, the readers, that he's utilizing these earlier days. And then Mike goes on to say he doesn't tell them that that language, he doesn't explain how language changes over time, that 1st century Greek is different from Hellenistic Greek, and which is different from the Greek used by Homer, which is different from the Greek used by in classical times. Okay. Okay. This is what, so again, he's making it like Cervin is not being a good scholar. Cervin actually covers this in another response to Grudem in a 2016 article. Okay. In a 2016 article, which is another response to Wayne Grudem. So Wayne Grudem wrote an article. Cervin wrote a rebuttal. Wayne Grudem wrote a rebuttal to Cervin's rebuttal. And then Cervin in 2014 wrote another rebuttal and then had it revised and posted on the Center for Biblical Equality, their website. It's posted there, and it was posted in 2016. Okay, and I think that was the last time they responded to each other. So Cervin, in his 2016 article, which is from a 2014 article, he covers how language and words can change over time. I wouldn't read the article. I've read it 2-3 times. He quotes from at least 3 New Testament lexicons in the article. Now, remember when Mike says he sees no value, he throws them out. In his article, he quotes 3 New Testament lexicons. He quotes from Thayer's, he quotes from the Theological Dictionary of the New Testament, and he quotes from Lau and Nita's semantic domains. He quotes from 3 Greek English New Testament lexicons. So the idea that he rejects all New Testament lexicons and thinks that they are irrelevant, not true. He also quotes and talks about Philo's use of Kephale, and he refers to Plutarch. These are authors during and close to the time of Paul. He also deals with passages in this 2016 article. He deals with passages in the New Testament that refer to head. He talks about Ephesians 1:22, Ephesians 4:15, Colossians 1:18, Colossians 2:19, Colossians 2:10, 1 Corinthians 11:3. He talks about all of this. However, Mike does not mention this article. I went and checked because he says, hey, you can look at some of Grudem's article, and he had a link for this current article from 1989. There is no link to the 2016 article. Now, why doesn't he link to the 2016 article? I don't know. But you would think that someone who says, I've done exhaustive research, would have read and covered this article. I found it. And by the way, it's easy to find. All you do, you punch in Dr. Richard Cervin's name, he comes up on Google. He only has one article on the CBE website, and it is the 2016 article. So it's not like Mike had to wade through a bunch of Richard Cervin articles on CBE in order to find this one. There's only one article. His rebuttal to Grudem in 2014, which was then updated and revised in 2016. And all of the things that he speaks against, he criticizes Cervin for, he covers in the last rebuttal to Grudem. Okay? So I don't know why I didn't know why he didn't find it or look at it. Um, when I was reading Cervin, I thought, was there anything else? And so I went and looked it up and I found the article and I've downloaded. I have the article. No, I didn't download the CBE, but I have the link for it, so I could always go and look it up. So my point here, reading all this, and let me say this too. Mike criticizes Cervin because he says he deals with all of this earlier stuff and he doesn't tell his readers. Here's the thing. First of all, Dr. Cervin, the article is in a theological journal. I forget which journal it is, but it's a theological journal. It's being written to other scholars. It's not being written to a lay audience. Other scholars would have recognized it. So he's writing to other PhDs. He's writing to other, people with master's degrees. People like my friend Nick Quinn and Allison Quinn, they're PhD candidates. Like my friend Becky Castle Miller, my friend Rory Blizzard. People who have PhDs, master's degree. They would have recognized these are earlier references, and they would have recognized what Cervin is doing. Oh, he's doing a corpus-based lexical analysis of Kephale. They wouldn't have had a problem with that. They understood what he was doing. Mike didn't understand the methodology. Okay. Also, Mike is like, well, he covers these earlier writings, but he doesn't cover anything near the time of Paul or Christ. He doesn't look at Philo. He doesn't look at Plutarch. But when you read Cervin's article, the 1989 one, he does deal with it because those are some of the references that Dr. Grudem deals with. And in the body of his article, Cervin does talk about Philo and he talks about Plutarch. So it's not true that he didn't deal with it. It just wasn't part of the earlier references that Dr. Cervin referenced to see if Kephale at earlier times meant leader. Okay. So again, the way Mike positioned this, he put Dr. Cervin in a position where it looked like Dr. Cervin was not doing good research. And he basically says that it's like, his work is compromised. It wasn't compromised. Mike didn't understand it. He didn't read it closely, and he didn't go do further research to find the article by Dr. Cervin and read that article also. Okay. So again, when it comes to this topic, this is why I say Mike is not a reliable guide. He doesn't do his homework well. Let me share with you two more clips, the last ones, and this will deal with Dr. Cervin's conclusions and then what Mike says about his conclusions. Okay, so let me bring these up for you. Clip 4, and then we'll look at clip 5, and then we'll be finished. Let me see. Here we go. And here we go. Clip 4. This is him giving. He's going to quote Dr. Cervin's conclusion at the end of his article about the meaning of Kephale.
His conclusion hurts the egalitarians. It doesn't help them. They quote Cervin all the time, but they don't quote this part of him. He concludes at the end of his paper, he says, what then does Paul mean by his use of head in his letters? He does not mean authority over, as the traditionalists assert, nor does he mean source, as the egalitarians assert. So he rejects both views. So then what does Cervin think? He says it means, and here's where like my brain just melts and falls out of my ears. He says it means preeminence. And I quote Cervin to you now. I promise, read it for yourself. I got a link below to his paper. You can read it for free. How can the husband be preeminent over his wife? In the context of the male dominant culture in which Paul was a part, such a usage would not be inappropriate. His conclusion hurts the egalitarians. It doesn't help them. They quote Cervin all the time, but they don't quote this part of him.
Now, Mike's view is that, let me move this, and then we'll come back to the last one. His view is that egalitarians are hurt by Cervin's conclusion. And that's not true. Now, Cervin has a different view. He doesn't think that Kephale really should be translated or that it means source. which a lot of egalitarians say, hey, it means source. He also, now it's interesting, Mike says this hurts egalitarians because he says it doesn't mean source. I'm going, well, it's interesting that you didn't say it hurts complementarians because he also said it doesn't mean authority over. Okay. He just moved it in one direction, he leaned in one direction. I was like, well, if it hurt egalitarians, it also hurts complementarians because he said it doesn't mean authority over it. And that's what complementarians believe that Kephale means. With that being said, he says, well, it doesn't mean that because of the meaning that Cervin gives to Kephale, which means to be preeminent over, or means preeminence, or to be preeminent, okay, or to have preeminence. Now, let me stick with my notes here. He quotes Cervin. He does quote him. I should say he reads what he says, but then he summarizes Cervin's words and Cervin's conclusions. Remember, I said last week when Mike begins to summarize, we're on dangerous ground. And once again, we get on dangerous ground because he doesn't summarize him correctly. Let me now play for you how Mike summarizes what Cervin said at the end of his article. I'm going to tell you right now, he gets it wrong.
So he says it doesn't mean authority over, it doesn't mean source, it means preeminence. And how could a husband be preeminent over his wife? Through male domination. Cervin concludes that it's a husband being in charge. And that's what it means when Paul writes it. Yet, what is going on between the scholars and the people? There's all these distortions that happen, then it gets to you guys. And you read egalitarian, forgive me, look, if you read egalitarian sources on this stuff, you will get distorted reality about these facts. And they'll quote Cervin, and it's like, and there's a million problems with it. Now,
okay, so Mike's view is that Cervin distorts. Now, this is what I said before at the very beginning. I said, this is why I'm doing this, because of what he says about egalitarian scholars, that they distort things. And then that distortions get out to the people. Now, people who are listening to Mike and have not done what I've done, or done what Taryn Williams has done, or Andrew Bartlett, or my friend Nick Quinn, or my friend Allison Quint, and other friends of mine who have looked at this, people will not know that Mike is misunderstanding, misinterpreting, and mischaracterizing what Cervin said. If you don't go back and look at it, and I know the majority of people who says, "Oh, I love Mike's series," they have not gone back and looked these things up. Say, Mike, how do you know that? Because when I ask them, "Have you gone back and looked these things up?" they never answer me back. They never say, "Yes, I did." Because I go, if you did, you would see Mike is misquoting what it said. And most people don't have the time, the energy. They're thinking, hey, and this is the fallacy people have. Mike is quoting all these egalitarian scholars. Surely he's right because he's quoting what they say. He is quoting them and then reinterpreting in his summation what they've said. Okay, let me share with you what. Let me see if I have it here. Do I have it? Do I have it? Do I have it? Oh, yes. Okay. This is what Cervin said. When this is the last paragraph in the article. When then, and I'm going to read from the beginning because Mike didn't read it for the full beginning. Not that that's necessarily a problem, but it just gives a little bit more context. What then does Paul mean by his use of head in his letters? He does not mean authority over, as the traditionalists assert. Today we would call them complementarians, nor does he mean source, as the egalitarians assert. This is when Mike says, oh, see, he hurts the egalitarian view. Well, he also hurts the traditionalist view. I think he is merely employing a head body metaphor and that his point is preeminence. Now, this is Cervin's view, it's preeminence. This is fully in keeping with the normal and common usage of the word. Both Plutarch and Philo use head in this way. Now, remember, Mike said he doesn't read Plutarch, he doesn't use Philo. He does. This is how he knows what they mean. He does do that. That's what I'm saying. Mike just totally misquotes the man and misunderstands. Both Plutarch and Philo use head in this way. And by the way, Mike said that about Cervin while having this article in front of him. And that's why I go like, Mike, you need to apologize because here you're saying Cervin doesn't even quote Philo. Cervin doesn't quote Plutarch. His research is compromised. You've got the article in front of you when he's referencing Plutarch and Philo. Okay, both Philo, both Plutarch and Philo use head in this way, and this usage is listed in the Liddell Scott Jones with other references. How can the husband be preeminent over his wife? In the context of the male dominant culture of which Paul was a part, such a usage would not be inappropriate. Let me say that again. In the context of the male dominant culture of which Paul was a part, such a usage would not be inappropriate. So, what is Dr. Cervin saying? And what is the mistake that Mike is making? Mike, again, he misunderstands, misrepresents, mischaracterizes an egalitarian scholar's work. Mike is confusing categories. He mistakes Cervin's sociological observation about how first century Greco Roman culture operated. He's confusing that and conflating it with a lexical definition. Dr. Cervin is making a statement about the culture of the day. Mike takes what he says about the culture of the day and and confuses that with his lexical definition. This is not what happened. In the first century Greco Roman world, as a rule, men were seen as socially superior. They were seen as superior rationally, intellectually, so therefore they were superior in virtue because virtue was seen as something that was the product of your reason or your intellect. So they were seen as being superior in virtue to women because their intellect, their rationality was seen as superior to women. Men were seen and treated as and men were seen and treated as superior to women in every way as a rule. They were given rights and privileges that were denied to women all because of gender. There were rules that applied to women that did not apply to men. There were rules about who you could have sex with that were that men had rules about that, but there were certain things that a man could do that a woman could not do. Women did have rights, they did have privileges, but they were not equal with men. Why? It's because the women were seen ontologically in terms of their essence. They were seen as being inferior to men, and the men were seen as being superior. So they were the privileged one. And this is what Cervin means by a male dominant culture. He is referring to the social realities that people lived in during that time in that culture. Cervin is not saying, hey, men are uh, preeminent because they boss and they're in charge of their lives. That's not what he was saying. He's saying that in a culture where men in every way are privileged over women, because of gender, they would be preeminent. They would be given the highly esteemed position or status in the relationship because that's the way the culture ran. They would be seen as the head. They would be seen as Kephale, or they would be seen as the highly esteemed and preeminent one because they were seen in the culture as being better than women. Now, yes, this would entail that they were seen as they would be in charge of things. They would have the rule, but Servant was not saying preeminent equals being ruled and dominated. He's saying in a male dominant culture, in a culture where men are privileged over women, the men are seen as the preeminent one, not the women. So therefore, Kephale, meaning preeminent in Servant's view, would be the appropriate way of referring to a man. Because in the culture of the day, this is how they would have been seen as the preeminent one. Okay. As the socially superior one is another way you could say it. As the one who was highly esteemed is another way you could say it. All right. Preeminent, and Cervin says this in his 2016 article that Mike doesn't quote. Cervin says preeminent does not mean or equal authority over. He literally says that in the article. He says it doesn't mean leadership, doesn't mean authority over. You can be preeminent in something and not be the leader. And I've said this before in earlier messages. I got that from Cervin. It's like the Olympics that just the the Winter Olympics, and they did ice dancing. Somebody won the gold, somebody won the bronze, somebody won the silver. I think American won the silver, and I think it was France that won the gold. So when you see them standing on the podium, who has the preeminent position? Who has the highest position? Who is at the head? The gold medal winner. But so they are preeminent over bronze and over silver. Silver is preeminent over bronze. It's on a lower platform. I think it's on a lower platform. If not, the bronze in the silver is higher than the bronze. But in saying it's more preeminent, does that mean that the ice skaters from France are the leaders and have authority over the ice skaters from America who won the silver? Or is the ice skaters who won the silver, who are from America, are they the leaders of the ones who won the bronze? No, they are preeminent though. They're more highly esteemed in terms of their medal, but being more highly esteemed does not make you a leader in the sense of that's what Kephale means. It means leader. It means you are the preeminent one. You might be a leader, okay, you might be a leader, but you would be preeminent for other, you could be preeminent for other reasons because you're a male, because you won a great victory in war. You'd be highly honored. You'd have higher status because you are wealthy. By the way, there's nuance to that when I said that men as a rule, this is why I said men as a rule were generally more preeminent than women, but a woman who had wealth. So let's say you were a female, like a friend of mine here online with us, Claudia. Let's say Claudia and I were in the first century Greco-Roman world. And let's say that I was a freed man, which is a slave who's been set free, versus being a Roman. As if I was born Roman, like Paul was a Roman citizen, and he says, the guy asked him, uh, how did you get your freedom? Did you buy it? Because the jailer who was talking to him, he said, I bought my freedom. He's known as a freed, with a D at the end, man. Paul said, I was born this way. So Paul's a free man. In the culture of the day, Paul has higher status than that man because Paul is a freeborn Roman citizen. Now, let's say we lived in the first century and Claudia, my friend, is a freeborn Roman citizen. And Aaron is a freeborn Roman citizen, but I was a slave who bought my freedom. Okay. Now, if Claudia and Aaron have the same amount of money, roughly, and they have the same background, roughly, okay, who is higher? Aaron is. Why? Aaron's a man. And he's going to have, in a Greco Roman male dominant society, he's going to have the higher status. I'm also a man, but because I am freed born, a former slave who has my freedom, Claudia would have higher status than me because she is freeborn and she's more wealthy. You understand? So there was nuances. There was rules to the game. You had to know the rules to the game. But as a general rule, if Claudia has the same amount of money and wealth as Aaron, and Aaron has the same amount of wealth as Claudia, and they come from similar backgrounds, Aaron would be seen as preeminent. He would be seen as having higher status. He would be the one in the socially superior position, even though they're equal in everything else, but it's because he's a man. So this is how it was understood within a first century world. This is what Dr. Cervin is saying, that in a male dominant society, utilizing head to mean preeminent one makes sense. This is how a husband could be the head of the wife because the husband would be the one in the relationship, according to Greco-Roman standards, who would be preeminent. In a Greco-Roman world, he would be seen as being the socially superior one in the eyes of the people. He would be the socially superior one. He would be the head. Now, you may say, well, how does that relate to Paul and in the book of Ephesians when he says, husbands, wives, submit yourselves to your husbands, for the husband is the head of the wife? Are you saying, Mike, that husbands are now socially superior to their husbands are socially superior to their wives? Well, I'll say this. Number one, keep in mind you are dealing with a first century text. Number two, we're dealing with how people are to relate to one another in the body of Christ. Number three, we're going to cover that when we'll cover in more detail when I get to Ephesians chapter 5. So I'm going to stop right there. Okay. Going to stop right there. All right. So Mike misunderstands and he thinks that Cervin is saying that preeminence equals being in charge or an authority over. No, Cervin doesn't mean that. He says that in the 2016 article and other places. Well, he says it in that article. Mike gets Cervin wrong. Mike says Cervin distorts things. Egalitarian scholars distorts things. No, the distortion is not on the part of Cervin. The distortion sad to say, is on the part of Mike. The distortion in this context is not on the part of egalitarian scholars. It is on Mike. He misunderstands, he misinterprets, he misrepresents, he mischaracterizes. He is the one that is distorting what they are saying. All right. Hope you got a lot out of that. That finishes what Mike Winger gets wrong about Kephale in terms of this video of his video number 8. We're going to be moving on from here, and I'm going to be talking more about Ephesians chapter 5. We're going to talk about 1 Corinthians chapter 11 and how we should look upon head and what it means when Paul says that the husband is the head of the wife. We're going to be looking at what does it mean when Paul says submit. Submit yourselves one to another, wives to husband. We're going to look at what all of that means in future videos. So thank you for joining us. If you're watching this on our YouTube channel, KIC TV, please hit the like button, hit the subscribe button. This helps the algorithm go out. I had somebody tell me just yesterday, they said, I was struggling with some things that Mike Winger was saying, and your video came up in my algorithm. I'm like, cool, we're starting to come up in people's algorithms. And they said they enjoyed it, and they thanked me for doing this class. So happy that you are watching with us. Please share this. If you're watching on Facebook, share this with other people. And Lord willing, we will see you next week. Bye-bye, everybody.